The small village nestled in the hills of northern France had once been a place of peace, its cobblestone streets echoing only the quiet chatter of villagers and the soft hum of everyday life. People knew each other by name, and the rhythm of the seasons dictated the flow of time. The scent of fresh bread often filled the air from the local boulangerie, and the sounds of children playing in the narrow lanes were a familiar, comforting soundtrack. The world outside this quiet haven seemed distant, almost like a foreign concern, until 1940. Until the war arrived. The distant rumblings of a conflict that had begun far across the ocean and in the heart of Europe were gradually drawing closer, and soon they would drown out the simplicity of village life forever. The first signs were subtle, an uneasy tension that began to creep into the everyday, an unfamiliar air of fear that no one could quite place at first. As German forces advanced through Europe, they cast a long shadow over the small village. It started with the rumors, stories carried on whispers from one family to another. The local newspaper carried reports of German divisions pushing through neighboring towns, taking over cities with alarming speed. Soon, whispers became warnings as the news turned grimmer and the threats more imminent. The occupying forces would arrive soon, and with them would come the devastation that had already engulfed other parts of France. At first, the villagers tried to continue life as usual, clinging to the familiar routines that had comforted them for so long. But the air became heavy with apprehension, as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The children were the first to notice. They had always been the most attuned to the mood of the village. They sensed that their world was shifting, and their carefree laughter began to fade. Instead of running through the streets after one another, they were often seen standing by their windows, peering out at the horizon, as if watching for a sign, any sign, that things might be different. The old men and women huddled together in quiet groups, discussing what the future might hold, but never in front of the children. The young men, usually the first to join in the conversations about the future, were now unusually silent. Their eyes betrayed their fear, their faces hollow with the weight of uncertainty. There was talk of resistance, of sabotage, of what might come, but it was all fragmented, half-spoken, as if no one was ready to voice what they feared would happen. And then, one afternoon, the first sign arrived. A column of German soldiers marched into the village. They were led by officers on horseback, their tall, imposing figures framed against the sky, their boots clicking sharply on the cobblestones. Behind them, a long line of soldiers, their faces grim and unreadable, moved in disciplined formation. They were like shadows, devoid of warmth or humanity, marching through the village as if they owned it. There was no fanfare, no warning, just the cold, mechanical precision of their arrival. The villagers scattered. Some ran into their homes, others ducked into alleys, seeking whatever shelter they could find. The children watched from behind closed windows, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breath held in fear. The soldiers moved quickly, methodically. They commandeered the town square, setting up checkpoints and inspecting the homes of the locals. There was no room for hesitation, no room for mercy. The villagers who had remained outside were ordered to the center of the square, where they were herded like cattle and forced to wait under the watchful eyes of the soldiers. The children, too young to understand the complexities of war, were terrified by the sight. They clung to their mothers, hiding behind them, their small faces pale with fear. It was not just the soldiers themselves that terrified them, but the atmosphere they brought with them, a sense of coldness and control that had never been present in the village before. The air was thick with tension, a silence that screamed louder than any words. After what seemed like an eternity, the soldiers finally left, but the damage had already been done. The village was marked. No longer was it a quiet place of refuge, a corner of peace amid the chaos of war. The occupation had begun, and its presence was felt in every corner of the village. The streets, once filled with the sound of children's laughter, now seemed deserted, as if the war had sucked the life out of everything. The boulangerie closed early, the farmers in the fields worked with an unnatural haste, and the village square, once a gathering place for gossip and trade, was now a tense and dangerous space, watched over by German soldiers at all hours. But it was not just the soldiers' presence that altered the village, it was the change in the people themselves. Fear had settled deep in their bones, and it transformed the way they interacted with one another. Conversations became whispers, and the streets, which had once been vibrant with life, grew quieter by the day. The children who once ran and played in the sun were now kept indoors, their lives confined to the four walls of their homes. Their world had shrunk. The threat of violence was now omnipresent, and every movement carried the weight of uncertainty. There was no escape from the clutches of fear. Still, even in the face of this new reality, something remarkable began to happen. Among the adults, some were still unwilling to surrender completely to the oppressive atmosphere. A few whispered among themselves that they would not go down without a fight, that they would not simply yield to the invaders. But those voices were rare, and they were quickly drowned out by the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that permeated the air. The children, in their own way, began to internalize this fear. Their innocence was stripped away, replaced by an understanding that they had never before known, the realization that their world was not as safe as they had once believed. They learned quickly to listen to the quiet of the night, to detect the subtle shift in the air when danger was near. They learned that the sound of boots marching down the street could mean something far worse than a mere passerby. It meant the arrival of fear. The laughter that had once filled the air, that light and joyful sound that was the heartbeat of the village, became a distant memory. It was replaced by the heavy silence that always followed the soldiers' movements. The children's laughter was now a rare and precious thing, hidden away in the deepest corners of their hearts. They learned that it was safer to be silent, to stay out of sight, and to pretend that they were not there. Even when they did venture out, they no longer played with the same abandon they once had. The game of tag that had once filled the streets with joy was replaced by a kind of solemnity, as if every movement had to be calculated, every decision weighed. The innocence of childhood was fading away, replaced by a quiet wariness that no one had expected. But amidst the suffocating fear, something else began to stir. It was a sound that seemed to contradict everything the children had known. One afternoon, as the children huddled together in their homes, hoping for the quiet stillness to last, they heard it. A sound that seemed out of place in a village occupied by Nazi forces, the sound of laughter. At first, they didn't believe it. Surely, it was a mistake. Surely, no one would dare laugh in the presence of such brutality. But then, as the laughter continued, soft and unfamiliar, the children found themselves drawn to it. They peered through their windows, trying to locate the source, but all they could see were the familiar faces of the soldiers patrolling the streets. And yet, the laughter persisted. It wasn't the harsh, cold laughter of the German officers that they had come to dread. It was something altogether different, softer, almost human. It was British laughter. The British soldiers who had slipped into the village under the cover of night were trying to reclaim some semblance of normality. Their laughter was a stark contrast to the terror that had engulfed the village. It was a sign of resistance, of something that could still remain intact even in the face of such overwhelming darkness. The children did not understand its full meaning, but they felt it nonetheless. It was the first glimpse of hope they had seen since the war arrived at their doorstep. And in that moment, something shifted. The walls of fear, though not gone, began to crack, allowing a flicker of light to shine through. That light was the first breath of something new, something that would change everything. The first time the children heard it, they could hardly believe their ears. The soft, almost melodic sound drifted into their homes, slipping through the cracks of closed shutters and the thick walls that had once provided safety. It was an unexpected sound, an intrusion into the silence that had become their new reality. Laughter. But it was not the harsh, authoritarian laugh of the German officers, the kind that always followed a brutal command or an order meant to instill fear. No, this was something different, something light and full of a kind of life they had long forgotten. British laughter. The laughter of the soldiers who had arrived, silently, under the cover of darkness, to help free them from the suffocating grip of occupation. At first, the children, startled by the sound, remained frozen in their homes, unsure of what to do. The soldiers' presence was something they had not expected. They had heard of the resistance, of the efforts to push back against the German invaders, but they had always believed it was something that happened far away. It seemed impossible that such an event could unfold in their own quiet, forgotten village. And yet, there it was, the laughter that now filled the streets, a strange, almost surreal contrast to the oppressive atmosphere that had gripped the village for months. It was not the laughter of men in uniforms of unyielding authority. It was the laughter of soldiers who seemed to have found a way to hold onto their humanity despite the darkness surrounding them. It was the kind of laughter that reminded the children of the days before the war, when they had played with abandon in the fields and in the streets, their lives untouched by the outside world. It was the kind of laughter that felt like a distant memory, a fleeting moment of joy that had been stolen by the shadows of war. But now, it was here again, and it seemed to echo through the village like a song of defiance. The British soldiers had arrived not with guns drawn, not with shouts or orders, but with an unexpected kind of quiet strength. They had arrived under the cover of night, slipping into the village like ghosts, unnoticed and unassuming. They did not come in the grand, dramatic fashion that the children had imagined when they thought of soldiers. There were no loud speeches or parades. There was only the steady movement of men in the dark, blending into the village as if they had always belonged there. The soldiers did not force their presence upon the villagers. Instead, they existed in the margins, observing, waiting, and preparing. For the children, the British soldiers were an enigma. They had never seen men like these before. They were not the cold, calculating figures that the Germans had been. The British soldiers seemed to walk with a kind of ease, as if they were still carrying the weight of the world but had somehow managed to find a glimmer of hope within themselves. They spoke in hushed tones, their words often carried away by the wind before the children could make sense of them. But they carried with them something that had been missing from the village for so long: warmth. Where the Germans had instilled fear with every word and movement, the British soldiers brought a kind of cautious optimism. They did not speak of victory or grand triumphs, but they spoke of resistance, of survival, of a future that was not yet written but still within reach. And yet, despite their quiet manner, the children couldn't help but notice the sharpness of their eyes, the way they always seemed to be watching, always aware of their surroundings. The British soldiers were not careless, not reckless in their movements. They had come with a purpose: to disrupt, to sabotage, and to gather information for the resistance. But it was the way they carried themselves, with humor and warmth amidst the chaos, that caught the attention of the children. They were not the faceless oppressors the children had come to expect. Instead, they were men who, despite the danger they faced, managed to hold on to a sense of normalcy, of connection to the very humanity that war sought to erase. As the days passed, the laughter continued to echo through the streets. It was a strange thing, almost foreign, to hear such a sound amidst the uncertainty and fear that had gripped the village. The soldiers' laughter was not the loud, raucous kind one might expect from men who had seen the horrors of war. It was softer, quieter, even a little awkward at times. It was laughter that seemed to be an act of resistance in itself. It was their way of refusing to let the war strip them of their dignity, of reminding the villagers that there was still some beauty in the world, even in the midst of chaos. At first, the villagers did not know how to react to this. Some were suspicious, unsure of the British soldiers' true intentions. They had heard rumors, of course, stories of underground resistance movements, of spies and saboteurs. But no one had ever imagined that their own village would become a site of such activity. The villagers had long been resigned to the fact that they would have to endure the war. They had accepted their new reality, even if it meant living under the constant threat of German soldiers and the fear of being caught in the crossfire of a conflict that seemed far too big for them to control. And yet, here were these soldiers, laughing and carrying on as if they were not in the middle of enemy territory, as if the world outside the village had not yet torn itself apart. Some of the villagers watched cautiously from their windows, unsure whether to approach or to keep their distance. The children, however, were drawn to the sound. They could not understand the full weight of the situation, but they recognized something in the laughter, something they had not heard for months, something that reminded them of their childhood, of simpler days. Slowly, they began to venture outside, lingering near the corners of streets, watching as the British soldiers moved through the village, still laughing and talking in low voices. It was not an invitation, not an open offer to join in the merriment, but the children felt a strange pull, a connection that was difficult to articulate. The soldiers' presence had become a paradox for the village. On the one hand, they represented a force that could change everything, a force that could disrupt the occupation and bring hope to those who had been living under its shadow. On the other hand, their presence was dangerous. The Germans would surely take note of these foreign soldiers, these intruders in their occupied territory. The villagers knew the stakes. They knew that if the Germans discovered the British soldiers, there would be consequences. The laughter they had heard could easily become the sound of something much darker, the sound of a village crushed under the weight of retaliation. Yet, even in the face of this danger, the British soldiers never faltered. Their laughter continued, a quiet but defiant sound that refused to be silenced. The children began to understand that the laughter was not just a noise, it was a message. It was a message of resistance, of defiance against the forces that sought to erase the life and soul of their village. In a world that had grown darker by the day, the laughter was a flicker of light, a reminder that they were not alone. The soldiers, despite the grave risks they faced, had found a way to hold on to their humanity, and in doing so, they reminded the villagers of their own strength. It was a small act, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of war, but it was powerful nonetheless. As the days wore on, the children began to notice more. They saw the British soldiers not just as soldiers, but as men who had been shaped by the same world that had shaped their parents, men who had lost their own homes, their own lives, to the war. The laughter, though strange, was not the sound of invaders. It was the sound of survivors, of people who had not given up hope. And in that, the children found something they hadn't realized they needed, hope. A spark, fragile but alive, had been kindled in their hearts. The laughter had softened the air, and with it, the village began to change. It wasn't just the soldiers who had changed. The children, too, began to change. They no longer hid in fear, no longer remained behind closed doors. They began to venture out more, watching and listening to the laughter that filled the streets, feeling the faint stirrings of something new. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was something else, something that could one day lead to it. The laughter had softened the air, and in its warmth, the children saw the first glimmers of something they had long lost, a sense of possibility. It was a new world taking shape, one where they could still dream of something better, even in the darkest of times. And that, more than anything, was what had changed everything. As the weeks passed in the wake of the British soldiers' unexpected arrival, the village began to change in subtle ways. Initially, the laughter that had so unexpectedly softened the air had offered a fleeting sense of relief, an oasis in a desert of fear. The children, their hearts still heavy with the burden of living in a war-torn world, started to believe that perhaps the tide was turning, that the arrival of the British soldiers might mark the beginning of the end of their terror. But as with all things in war, hope was often fragile, fleeting. Beneath the surface of what appeared to be a peaceful coexistence, a deeper, darker current was beginning to stir. The village, despite the laughter and the faint glow of hope, was teetering on the edge of an even more dangerous precipice. The German forces, ever watchful, had begun to grow suspicious. The British soldiers, though careful and secretive in their operations, were no longer as invisible as they had once been. It became clear that the German occupiers were no longer simply tolerating the presence of these foreign soldiers. They were actively searching for them. The village, once a quiet and peaceful place, had turned into a fragile battleground, a place where every whispered conversation and every furtive glance had the potential to unravel the delicate balance that had been struck. The villagers, who had once been isolated in their fear and uncertainty, now found themselves caught between two worlds. On one hand, they were grateful for the presence of the British soldiers. They offered a glimmer of resistance against the Nazi oppression that had suffocated their lives. Yet, on the other hand, they were fearful of the consequences. The Germans were ruthless in their reprisals. If they discovered the British soldiers hiding among them, the village would suffer, everyone would suffer. The Germans had made it clear, time and time again, that anyone caught aiding or harboring resistance fighters would be punished without mercy. The stakes were growing higher, and the villagers knew it. Every act of defiance, every quiet movement of the British soldiers, now carried the weight of unimaginable risk. It wasn't just the adults who understood this. The children, though they had been shielded from much of the ugliness of war, were beginning to grasp the reality of the situation. They saw the way their parents' faces had grown more tense, the way the adults spoke in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. They saw the soldiers, British and German alike, moving through the streets with a quiet sense of purpose, always alert, always on edge. The children had once found comfort in the laughter that had filled the air, but now they felt a tightening in their chests whenever they heard it. It wasn't the carefree sound it had once been. It had become something more, an act of rebellion, a silent challenge to the forces that sought to crush them all. The British soldiers, despite their soft laughter and seemingly harmless demeanor, were at the center of a storm, and the children could feel it brewing. The village, once an island of calm amidst the chaos of war, had become a focal point, a symbol of resistance and defiance in a world that was increasingly marked by collaboration and submission. The British soldiers, though few in number, had a profound effect on the spirit of the people around them. They did not shout or demand respect. They earned it through their actions, their unwavering resolve. But this only made the situation more precarious. The longer the British remained, the more likely it became that the Germans would turn their attention to the village. They would seek out the resistance, and they would stop at nothing to root it out. It was in these moments of tension that the children began to understand the true nature of the world they were now living in. They could see the soldiers' actions for what they were, not just as an external force of liberation but as a constant source of risk for everyone around them. The laughter that had once symbolized hope now became something far more complicated, a dangerous defiance that stood in stark contrast to the fear that gripped the village. The children, who had once been filled with innocent wonder, began to grasp the concept of secrecy, of hiding in plain sight, of being watched by eyes that would show no mercy if caught. The British soldiers, despite their good-natured demeanor, had become part of the fabric of the village in a way that could not be undone. They had infiltrated the life of the village not by force but by stealth, by simply blending into the background, learning the rhythms of the place, and observing without drawing attention to themselves. They had become a part of the daily life, the quiet figures who passed by the market stalls, who greeted the villagers with warmth, and who, in their own way, had become a symbol of resistance. Yet, this very integration into the village life made them more vulnerable. The Germans were not foolish. They knew that the resistance could not function without help, and they knew that every corner of the occupied territories was filled with eyes and ears looking for signs of subversion. The villagers began to feel the weight of this awareness. As the presence of the British soldiers became more pronounced, the undercurrents of suspicion began to rise. The villagers, once unified in their quiet fear, began to divide. Some remained steadfast in their belief that the British soldiers were their only hope for survival, for freedom. These villagers spoke of the future, of a time when the Germans would be driven out and peace would return. They believed that every small act of defiance mattered, that every bit of sabotage, every hidden message, every small victory could help turn the tide. But there were others who felt a different way. They were not so sure that they wanted to risk everything for an uncertain future. The presence of the British soldiers made them nervous, afraid of the potential backlash. The Germans had not yet found the resistance, but how long could they remain undetected? How long before the whole village was destroyed in a blaze of retaliation? These villagers whispered in corners, cast wary glances at their neighbors, and spoke in code, as if they, too, feared that even the slightest misstep might lead to the unraveling of everything. The tensions were building, and the children, caught in the midst of this uncertain atmosphere, could feel the strain. They watched their parents grow more anxious, more withdrawn. They saw the once lively streets grow quieter, the sounds of the village muted by the heavy silence that now hung in the air. They knew that something was shifting, that the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of what was to come. It wasn't just the soldiers who had changed, the villagers had too. The British soldiers, while their presence remained a quiet defiance to the occupying forces, were now becoming more active in their efforts to aid the resistance. The days of simply moving through the village, blending in with the locals, were over. Now they moved with purpose. They gathered intelligence, made contact with local resistance cells, and began to coordinate small acts of sabotage against the German forces. These acts were subtle but deliberate, disrupting supply lines, sabotaging communications, and gradually wearing down the occupying forces. But these actions did not go unnoticed. The Germans began to tighten their grip on the village. Patrols became more frequent, more aggressive. Soldiers began searching homes, demanding to know if anyone was hiding British soldiers or aiding the resistance. It was only a matter of time before the Germans would discover the truth. The question was no longer whether the British soldiers would be caught, but when. The children could see the soldiers becoming more cautious, more secretive. They no longer laughed as openly as they had before. They began to move with more stealth, blending into the shadows of the streets. The carefree warmth that had once defined their presence had been replaced by a quiet, purposeful vigilance. The villagers, too, grew more cautious. They spoke less in public, watched their neighbors more carefully, and took every precaution to hide their involvement in the resistance. The village that had once been a quiet, unassuming place was now a powder keg, its fate uncertain. The children, still too young to understand the full gravity of the situation, sensed the change. They saw the way their parents' eyes darted nervously when the soldiers passed by. They saw the quick, furtive conversations, the hurried glances, the sudden silences when someone knocked on a door. The children understood, in a way, that something was happening in the village, something that made the laughter they had once heard feel like a distant memory. The village was changing, shifting beneath their feet. They could feel the tension, thick as smoke, wrapping around their world. The walls that had once felt so safe now seemed to be closing in on them. The laughter had softened the air, yes, but now the air was filled with something else, something darker, more dangerous, as the true cost of resistance began to reveal itself. The village had changed, and so had they. The world they had known was gone, and in its place was a new reality, one where fear and hope, danger and defiance, coexisted in a delicate balance, a balance that could tip at any moment. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was here, in the streets, in the hearts of every villager, and the children were learning that survival was a lesson they could not afford to ignore. The tension in the village had reached a fever pitch. Every corner seemed to be filled with an unspoken awareness, a sense of inevitability that something was about to break. The German soldiers, once methodical and distant, were now visibly on edge. They had begun to increase their patrols, their eyes sharp and focused as they combed through the streets. The village had become a powder keg, and it was only a matter of time before something sparked the explosion. The British soldiers, though careful in their movements, were becoming more active in their resistance efforts. No longer content to hide in the shadows, they were now working openly with the local resistance. Small acts of sabotage, cutting telecommunication lines, disrupting German supply trains, and damaging the equipment of occupying forces, had begun to escalate. The villagers who had once been uncertain of the British soldiers' true intentions now found themselves slowly drawn into this web of resistance. They were no longer merely passive witnesses to the war, they were participants in it. But even as the resistance efforts intensified, so too did the pressure from the German forces. The occupying soldiers began to tighten their grip on the village, increasing their search for any trace of the resistance. They had grown more aggressive, conducting searches of homes, interrogating villagers with increasing brutality. Everyone was a suspect now, and the once unified community was beginning to fracture under the strain. The atmosphere had become suffocating. The streets that had once echoed with the carefree voices of children were now quiet, filled with an oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. The children, who had once played freely, now moved with a wariness in their steps. They no longer ran through the fields with laughter in their throats, their voices blending with the wind. They moved quietly, staying close to their homes, avoiding the patrolling soldiers and the watchful eyes of their parents. The innocence of their childhood had been stripped away, replaced by a quiet fear that made every moment feel like it could be their last. The villagers, too, had become more withdrawn. Once a community bound by shared history and experience, they had now become a fractured group of individuals, each person wrapped in their own private fear. Conversations had grown quieter, and whispers passed between neighbors behind closed doors. Even the simplest of interactions carried with it the weight of suspicion. Neighbors no longer greeted each other with the same warmth. Their interactions had become strained, loaded with an understanding that anyone could be a traitor, anyone could be the one to bring the wrath of the German forces down upon them all. The village that had once been a place of comfort and familiarity had become a place of isolation. The once vibrant streets now seemed lifeless, as if the war had sucked the life out of everything. And yet, in the midst of all this, there was still a quiet resilience. The British soldiers, despite the growing dangers, did not falter. They continued to operate in the shadows, moving through the village like ghosts, helping the resistance whenever they could. The villagers had come to see them not as foreign invaders but as fellow sufferers in a world of chaos. The British soldiers had become part of the fabric of the village, not by force or power but by the shared struggle. They were the reminder that there was still something worth fighting for. The laughter that had once filled the air now seemed to have been replaced by something more subdued. It wasn't that the soldiers had lost their sense of humor, it was that the war had taken on a new dimension, one that made every small act of rebellion a matter of life and death. The stakes were higher now. Every action was watched, every word scrutinized. Even the children, who had once been blissfully ignorant of the weight of the world, now understood that they were living on a razor's edge. It was not just the soldiers who had changed. The villagers had too. In the beginning, there had been a sense of community, a collective understanding that they would endure the war together, that they would survive by sticking together. But now, fear had torn that bond apart. Every village was a target, and in the face of the growing danger, people began to look out only for themselves and their families. Loyalty had become a fragile thing, easily broken by the reality of survival. The fear of betrayal was ever present, gnawing at the edges of every conversation, every glance exchanged in secret. Everyone had become a potential informer, and no one knew who they could trust. It wasn't just the presence of the German soldiers that had changed everything, it was the fear of their own neighbors. The village had become a place where no one could afford to speak too freely, to share too openly. Silence had become a defense mechanism, and those who spoke too loudly risked being branded as traitors, or worse, collaborators. In the midst of all this, the children's lives had become a series of small acts of survival. They were no longer the carefree youngsters who once ran through the fields, their laughter echoing through the streets. They were now caught in a world of tension and fear, their lives shaped by the dangers that surrounded them. They had learned the hard truth, that the world they had once known, a world where they could play without worry, was gone. The village had changed, and so had they. No longer did the children rush to their friends' houses, eager for games and stories. Now, they lingered in their own homes, their eyes peeking out from behind windows, watching the streets for any sign of danger. Every movement outside their windows was scrutinized, every footstep on the cobblestone streets weighed and measured. They knew that the wrong sound, the wrong movement, could mean the difference between life and death. It was during this time that the village began to see the true nature of the war. In the past, they had thought of the war as something distant, something that had come from far away. But now, the war was here. It was in the streets. It was in the eyes of the German soldiers who patrolled their homes. It was in the whispers of betrayal that floated through the cracks in the walls. The war was no longer something happening to distant strangers. It was happening to them. They were no longer merely passive victims. They were participants in the war, caught between two sides. The children, too, had become part of the larger struggle. They had begun to learn the ways of survival. They understood the importance of silence, of watching from the shadows. They had learned to hold their breath when soldiers passed by, to wait for the danger to pass before venturing out into the streets. And then came the day when the first major confrontation occurred. The German soldiers had grown increasingly suspicious of the British presence in the village, and their searches had become more aggressive. One night, the Germans arrived with orders to search every home in the village. They kicked in doors, overturned furniture, and demanded to know where the resistance fighters were hiding. The air was thick with tension as the villagers, wide-eyed and trembling, were forced to sit and watch the soldiers ransack their homes. The children, their hearts pounding in their chests, huddled in the corners, praying that they would be overlooked. They could feel the heat of the soldiers' anger in the room, the terror that gripped their parents as they were interrogated and threatened. The The search seemed endless, a never-ending nightmare that left the village shaken to its core. The children would never forget the faces of their parents, pale and grim, as they stood under the German soldiers' gaze, helpless to do anything but wait. When the soldiers finally left, the silence that followed was deafening. The village seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, but it was a hollow relief. The German forces had not found the resistance fighters, but they had left a mark on the village, one that could not easily be erased. The village had been tested, and it had come through, barely. But the fear remained. It would not go away. The villagers, who had once stood united in their quiet resistance, now knew that the price of defiance was higher than they had ever imagined. The laughter that had once echoed through the streets now seemed like a distant memory, a time when they could still imagine a future beyond the war. But now, that future seemed increasingly uncertain. The stakes were higher. The villagers had no illusions left. The war was no longer something abstract, something distant. It was here, in their homes, in their streets, in their hearts. The battle for survival had truly begun.